May the words of my lips and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Varai. Hello, friends. If you're watching this is the either live or taped service for this weekend, the Sunday of the 24th of May. I'm filming it on the 22nd, on the Friday, but it's available to watch whenever. We are trying this on YouTube Live. We'll see how it goes. There may be technical difficulties. But I'm reminded that worship is always a little bit of safety, hopefully a little bit of the familiar and the comfortable, and a little bit of risk and adventure. So today will be an adventure as well as hopefully some comfort. So let us settle into this place and be ready for this time of worship. A note about today's service. The sermon is a repeat of, mostly, changed it a little bit, of the sermon given last week at Rivington. There were audio difficulties then as well on Zoom. So hopefully now you'll be able to hear the whole thing. It is primarily geared at sort of the Unitarian and Free Christian movement today. It's not normally what I do, but today we're thinking about the future and the past of Unitarianism. I hope that there might be something into it to appeal to my friends of all other denominations and none. But this is especially about what is the place of Unitarianism in a time such as this, though I think those of other faiths may find something that speaks to them in the midst of that sermon. And we'll be drawing on the past today, especially my colleague, the Reverend Theophilus Lindsay, who lived in the 18th and early 19th century. But I'm also drawing on, and I don't mention him, so I want to mention him in thanks. Reverend Stephen Lingwood's book was an inspiration, Seeking Paradise, which has just come out, so I recommend it to you. Speaking of books, for our chalice lighting, we'll do a book that I was honored to be the editor of, Grains of Sand, Rays of Light, by the Northwest Provincial Assembly. And this is from the first reading in that book is by the Reverend Anna Jarvis, so she'll have our opening reading here today, Reverend Anna Jarvis. I'm going to read a little bit of it. And I hesitated to do it because it talks about marching. And of course, we're still in lockdown, even though it's changed a little bit. But it speaks about the time being now. And I think there's something beautiful about this reading, even though it was written well before the lockdown, thinking about the time is always now. The time is now, even as we're in lockdown. I thought I would read this stirring reading, which is a meditation unto everything there is a season, which is from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. For everything there is a season. You may have heard of that. Time to love, time to hate, a time for gathering stones, a time for, I'm going to forget the whole reading. But anyway, you can read it. It's Ecclesiastes 3. And this is Anna Jarvis's take on this time. I will wait no longer. If there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven, then now is the season for revolution. It is time to rise up and preach the gospel of love, the lesson of compassion, the reading of respect, and the hymn of humanity. It is time to redraw the lines of class, culture, country, to include everyone within the circle so that no one is left out. No one feels the cold of exclusion, but all are held, cherished, nurtured, fed, and warmed by gentle hearts. Gentle hearts, yes. But now is the time to be angry, to march against the injustice, to sing against the stifling silence, to dance against the manacles and chains. We will wait no longer. No time to be timid. No time to seek permission. No time to form committees or working parties or focus groups. No time to write drafts for discussion. Version 1, 2, 300. If there is a season, if there is a time, then our time is now. And we must rise to claim it. We will wait no longer. This is the time of revolution, the revolution of love and justice. Strap on your boots and get marching, because this is the time. As we settle into this time of worship, I will strike our gong and I let it sound in the silence that surrounds the sound to ground us in our being in this moment in time. Now, I mentioned in the introduction that this be talking about Theophilus Lindsey, and I'm riffing off a sermon using the same text that he used in 1774, which could be said to be the founding of Unitarianism. There's a lot of maybe disagreement about that, and it depends on the country. But in England, it was in many ways this first kind of officially Unitarian sermon was this sermon in London, in Essex Street, this church that Theophilus Lindsey was founding in 1774. And there in the congregation were two names you might know, Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Priestley, two major figures in both British and American history, scientists both, theologians both, amazing thinkers both, and both Unitarians. I'd like to read Theophilus's opening prayer. I'll read the first half of it. Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Priestley heard, and many others. And we will hear here today. And the language may be a little bit old-fashioned for some of us, perhaps, but I hope that you can hear it in your own being, in your own tradition. This is the prayer from Theophilus Lindsey. Unto thee do we lift up our eyes, O thou that dwells in the heavens. O Lord, the great and glorious God, who has made all things and sustains and orderest all things by thy wise and good providence, who gives wisdom to all that ask it of thee, to whom alone we look up for a blessing and success on all that we take in hand. We beseech thee to look down upon us, thy creatures and servants, who have here assembled ourselves together as the disciples of thy Son, Jesus Christ, to edify one another in thy holy word, and to render unto thee, O thou most high, that supreme worship, reverence, and praise, which are only due unto thee. For thou art God alone, and beside thee there is no other. May we be found among thy true worshippers, such as thou seekst to worship thee, and make us ever mindful of that pure and undefiled religion before thee, O God and Father, which thou hast told us consists in acts of mercy and kindness, and in keeping ourselves unspotted from the world. Mercy and kindness and disciples of Jesus Christ, or as we might say, disciples of love. We all, from our various traditions, are disciples of love. Now, one such disciple of love is David Dawson, whose funeral was yesterday, who was an honored Unitarian. He contributed on a number of hymnals, including the Green Hymnal, which we're singing from today, and was an amazing lyricist, a wonderful person, a warm soul. And if I can get it working, we're going to try to play his hymns, and so you can sing along at home to these. And I don't know if YouTube's going to let us. We do have copyright permission for these, but this first one is about the blessings of community supporting friends, and David worked on these. So I don't know how well the sound's going to work, but we'll give it a try. It's from the Green Hymnal. It's number 177. It's to the tune of Amazing Grace, which you might know. So feel free to just sing Amazing Grace if you don't know these different lyrics. But we'll sing this one together. Unity supporting friends. In fellowship and giving full and free. Oh, let us live with humankind. holy God, you are God, souls set free. Rescued with love, forever. You are the earth and me. Amen. I don't know how well you could hear that, and I'm just glad that our algorithm corporate overlords haven't stopped the stream yet for playing music. But I hope you were able to sing along. And if not, know that that was a hymn called Community Sporting Friend, which is about blessings of community. And I know that many of us are sorely missing community when we can't be together in person, in body, and in one building, and that day will come. But in the meantime, let's remind ourselves that we are in community. We are in community over the space of many different homes and throughout the internet and in our hearts. We are one community here. So with that, we will have a reading, and as I say, this is from the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4, and this was the text that Reverend Lindsay spoke about in 1774, and it has a message for us here today. So I'll read this text from Ephesians chapter 4, and this is from the New Revised Standard Version tradition, which is not what Reverend Lindsay would have been reading from 1774, but you can read the King James, which he probably would have been as well at home. Paul writes, I therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and all. But each of us was given grace. Ephesians chapter 4. One body and one Spirit. So now I'm going to read the sermon here today. We're going to have a little prayer after the sermon and another song, but I'll go into the sermon on that reading, and I have to look at the sermon on thing. So if this cuts out, I'll try and make sure I check that. I'll read the reading one more time. Therefore, the prisoner in the Lord beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. When my predecessor, the Reverend Philip Pearsall Carpenter, took on the ministry of Cairo Street Chapel in Warrington in the winter of 1846 to 1847, it was during a time of great famine. In a letter to an American friend, Carpenter wrote that most of the mills had stopped, and a great many people had no work. There was a fever going around that was twice as bad, he wrote, as cholera. The stench of sickness in some of the boarding houses was almost unbelievable. Carpenter wrote that they had now gotten so accustomed to seeing people with starving faces that one hardly thought of it. One hardly thought of it to see the faces of Warringtonian residents stretched thin with hunger. This was the beginning of his ministry. You can imagine he might have been daunted by the prospect before him. I know I would have been. Yet he wrote to his friend, speaking of his family's move to Warrington, I consider it a great mercy that we were sent here when we were. We have not For we have not only been useful ourselves, but have been able to stir up others. Friends, my aim for this sermon is to ask you to consider what a mercy it is that we are here in this challenging and hurting world today. It is a mercy that we are here. For we have the great possibility to be of help to others and to stir one another up to save the world. How lucky we are and how blessed to be alive at this moment in world history. Now, there's a lot we can do ourselves, water here, even from where we are, whether we are locked down totally in our homes or able to go out once a day or twice a day or what have you, or working on in the hospitals and care homes and retail establishments. There's a lot we can do no matter where we are. But I want to talk today specifically about the Unitarian and free Christian movement and what's possible for us as a movement. And there's always been a lot of conversation about this. For as long as the word Unitarian has been in use in Britain as well as America for these last 200 years or so, we have been asking, what is the role of Unitarianism in the world? What is our point? Why are we here as a movement? I propose no final answers to that question here today, but I would like to address it, looking at both our honored and esteemed traditions, as well as the extraordinary challenges we face as a global community, both in this year of 2020 and in the years to come. When we look at our tradition, one of the aspects of these discussions about what we're all about has been a creative tension between the specificities of our tradition with the generalities of how we apply that tradition. What I mean by that, which I know is a mouthful, is Unitarian historically comes out of a specific tradition, as all traditions do. Here in the UK, Unitarianism has been, for the most part, an ever-evolving branch of the dissenting Christian tradition. Our pre-Unitarian ancestors broke away from the Church of England in 1662. A few of the congregations that sprung from that dissension would identify as Unitarian, would come to identify as them several generations later in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And Essex Chapel was one of those. Unitarian refers to, in terms of its strict definition, a particular view about Jesus, that Jesus was a human being like us, and taught that the greatest worship of the one God was in devotion to our universal Father, the metaphor for God, and in acts of love and justice. Now, many Unitarians have claimed biblical support for their argument, including the text from Ephesians we just heard. Now, the generalness of our faith comes out of this particular specificity. If Jesus was human like us and preached the worship of God, it follows, not unreasonably, that Judaism and Islam, our sister religions, are not wrong in urging devotion to God as well. And perhaps Unitarians continued that vein of argument. Perhaps there is some grain of truth to Buddhism and Shintoism and Hinduism and all the other great world religions as well, however many gods they do or do not profess. And this line of argument came into play very early, from the early 19th century. And as we saw, perhaps the first Unitarian sermon could be said to be in the UK was 1774. So we're not talking a long time in evolution till we came to that view that perhaps there is a grain of truth to all religions. For most of our history, we have been a faith tradition that stresses tolerance and pluralism. Part of this stems from the fact that historically we know what it feels like to not be tolerated. Indeed, Theophilus Lindsay's 1774 sermon on the founding of Essex Chapel is all about toleration. He stressed in that sermon that surely God meant there to be different strains of Christianity, interpretations of Christianity. God did not mean us to be all exactly the same. Nor did God intend that our differences would prevent us from working together on a profound and deep level. Now, to be historically accurate, Theophilus Lindsay was just talking about Christianity in that 1774 sermon. He did not say in that particular sermon about other faiths, but it wasn't very long, as I said, before Unitarians said that maybe the other great religions have some truth to them as well, and maybe no faith, has a monopoly on all the truth. So you can see in Unitarianism, we have this interplay from very early on in our tradition between the generality of all religions having some truth and the generality of our stress on tolerance and pluralism, universalism, you might say, as well as the specificity of Jesus's call. This call that we read in the Gospels to follow him in service, to proclaim the kingdom of heaven, to love our neighbor. Now, this may sound like just a lot of theological conversation, but I want to point out that in that interplay between the specificity and the general, somehow in the 19th century, in a very quick time, we helped create the modern world, which is a pretty stupendous creation. And we played a small but pretty significant role in that. There in the chapel, I remind you, we had Joseph Priestley, who had recently moved south from Leeds, and Priestley's buddy from Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin, who was living in London and would sign the American Revolution about 2 years after that sermon. Priestley and Franklin were unquestionably two greats of the modern world, as well as both of them being involved in statescraft and religious study. They helped discover the properties of electricity and oxygen, as well as helping found America, in Ben's case. If you look just at the scientific achievements of these two people, you have chemicals and electricity. Chemicals and electricity. They were helping to found an almost unimaginable age, an age of cars and boats and planes and plastics, computers and electromagnetic forces and shuttles to the moon and so on. All wonderful things. We are meeting today thanks to the internet. All also, in their way, extremely dangerous things. Dangerous because we can produce so many of them endlessly, but there are consequences to producing millions and millions of these things. As we now know, as our oceans are filling up with junk and the coral reefs are dying, as our skies are filling up with unhealthy levels of carbon dioxide and pollution kills millions throughout the globe. As our earth is emptying of materials that are not endless, and as the surface of our earth is being covered and changed in profound ways that change so much in ways we do not yet fully understand. Science has made our lives better in so many ways, but there are limits, we are learning. To paraphrase Sonny Curtis and The Clash, we fought the law of nature, and the law of nature is going to win sooner or later. The only way for us is to find a way to work with nature rather than endlessly fight against it. And potentially science can help us with that. And thousands of scientists are trying to do just that, find ways to work with nature. Unitarians helped build that modern world. We played a pretty important role as scientists and as well as societal changers, as creating the structures of our modern society. Now, the modern world is an imperfect place, and human society feels very unstable at the minute. And I understand we could be very tempted to say, well, if Unitarians help create this mess, enough of our hubris. Let us step back from messing around with creation and be humble. Now, I do believe humility is an important virtue now more than ever. But I do not think it particularly humble at this juncture in human history to say we won't get involved, to abscond ourselves from moral responsibility, especially if we are still contributing to the problem, still using our cars and going on holidays and eating meat or what have you. That's not really humble. That's really coming from a place of privilege to say, well, I won't bother attending to the problems. A truer humility might be to say, I know our tradition has been imperfect, has made mistakes, and I know I make mistakes, errors of omission and commission, make mistakes throughout the course of my life. But nevertheless, I will do what I can. Future generations will look back and say, what did you do? I will try to do something. I will not seek to go it alone, not pretend that I have all the answers. I will seek out the wisdom of others especially those whose voices have been grievously neglected by society for so long, the voices of indigenous people, of women, of migrants, of the poor. And I will put my shoulder to the wheel of change, careful not to make matters worse if I can, but mindful that we do need to make things better. And we can make things better. Together, we can. There is one body and one spirit, as the writer of Ephesians puts it, or as you might say, we are all in this together. We've heard that phrase before. We are all in this together. And it's no doubt very, very true. While we are in the midst of this profound global pandemic, it's worth pointing out that Unitarians have long been involved in public health. I mentioned Pearsall Carpenter before, and he served on the Sanitary Commission while he was in Warrington. He is remembered by a fountain behind the town hall. Not much remembered fountain, unfortunately, and I'm glad it hasn't been torn down. But it's not an accident that his friends and admirers chose to remember Carpenter with a fountain, because he worked very hard to make sure that the town had a public supply of healthy water, water that wouldn't transmit cholera and other diseases. Carpenter had a profound moral imagination. He was able to envision a better world for those around him. And he knew it involved all of us, that we'd have to work for public solutions for these problems. Perhaps the greatest moral imagination of that age belonged to Florence Nightingale, nurse, statistician, public health advocate, writer, and visionary. Not technically a Unitarian, she didn't self identify as one, but her father was, and we have so much to learn from her anyway. She wrote, "Rather 10 times die in the surf, heralding the way to a new world, than stand idly by on the shore." Nightingale imagined that new, better world. She combined statistics and writing and public health because she knew it was something we had to do in big ways. We needed big imaginings to think of how we could live together on this earth and live well, live healthily, and create a better world. Rather 10 times die in the surf, heralding the way to a new world, and stand idly by on the shore. A lot of the human failures around this pandemic have been failures of the moral imagination. In 2018, the President of the United States, President Trump, cut hundreds of millions of dollars of funding from pandemic preparedness programs. Worrying about things that might or might not happen in the future, where is the benefit in that politically? There isn't much. So the funding was cut away. Whether this funding could have prevented the COVID-19 outbreak is unknown, but I think it's pretty clear that thousands more qualified scientists employed to be working on identifying threats and what to do about them could have made a huge difference and saved lives. We know that similar programs, many funded by the US government, were affected in reacting to the SARS and Ebola outbreaks. But when coronavirus came along, the US pandemic defense budget was scraped to the bone, and there was no capacity to react. It was a failure of moral imagination. Now, moral imagination is not quite the same thing as smarts. The president of the US is certainly smart enough to know the basics of how viruses work. He and his vice president are tested every day. Everyone who comes into contact with him in the West Wing is tested every day, and they are traced to see who they come into contact with. If they test positive for coronavirus, they are isolated. So the president and his advisors know how this virus operates. He simply refuses to treat others as he treats himself. It's a failure of moral imagination. Love others as you love yourself. The heart of Jesus' teaching isn't complicated, but it isn't easy either. Many have failed this test of moral imagination. Unitarianism calls us to proclaim truths that are simple to state, but very challenging to practice. We're all in this together. Love others as you love yourself. Proclaim liberty to captives and good news to the poor. One body, one spirit, one hope. Proclaim that we really are all in this together, not just as idle rhetoric, but in the ultimate relationship of our lives, how we live our lives with God and with one another. As we face this challenging future, both the pandemic and the wider challenge of how we live sustainably on the earth, moral imagination is of the utmost importance for our species. We need the moral imagination of Nightingale and Carpenter and Priestley and Franklin, the courage to envision a better world even when it may seem impossible, even when we do not know the way there, which is most of the time. We need the moral imagination Jesus spurred us onto to find the means within to love the holy, love God, love this world with all our heart, and love our neighbor as ourselves. We can change this world. We've done it before, more than once. We can make it better. I'm not saying perfect, nothing is perfect but God. I'm saying that if we act with moral imagination and compassion, as well as have the humility to work together, things will happen beyond our meager individual understandings and fears. Things better than we can imagine on our own. Open your heart to the promise of God. Open your heart to the promise of love. Open your heart to the hope of a better world, and open your heart to the humility to put your shoulder to the wheel. There is no reason why we cannot build a better world than this, a fairer world, a more just world, a kinder world, a more beautiful world. A world of better relationships between one another, a world of better relationships between ourselves and the majestic laws of nature that govern our ecosystem, a world of better relationships with our sisters and brothers, the animals, and nature. A world that is planned with the care and reason that we have as our human species, a world that is true to the deepest stirrings of the heart. This is the year of the Lord's favor. It is a great mercy that you are here now. Now let's start saving the world. Amen. I'd like to close with a prayer and then we'll have a song. Would you gather your hearts in prayer, friends? Source of all, indescribable mystery that moves among us and between us. We give thanks for the wonder that is in our hearts and for all the friends that are in our keeping. We are connected with one another even when we are apart. We are one body and one spirit, carrying one hope, the hope of fullest living, of truth lived out in justice and kindness and faithfulness and compassion. We hold in our hearts throughout this week all those who are risking their lives, those who are protecting the vulnerable. Nurses, care home workers, doctors, NHS, aides and assistants, all those who are there for others, whether in a professional capacity or simply extending a helping hand to a neighbor. Blessed are those who love their neighbors. Our heart is with all those who are lonely in this challenging time. All those who are feeling aggravated, upset, confused, all those who cannot deal with what ultimately cannot be dealt with sometimes. May they know your love, O Spirit of all. We pray they might know our love too. May they know consolation, and may all their emotions lead them to the promised land of peace beyond all understanding and connection with the global community, connection with love. We keep in our hearts all those that mourn. May they be comforted in the midst of this terrible time of sorrow and loss. We hold in our hearts, especially this hour, family of David Dawson, much loved by the Unitarian movement. Family of Malcolm Tomaszewski. Family of Gareth Lowe. Family of Bill Good. Family of Daphne Roberts. And all those who have lost someone in the past months, know that we are with you in mourning. May the memory of those you have lost always be as a blessing in your life. And may love and mercy and compassion find its way back to your hearts again and again on the road ahead. We give thanks for our Unitarian and free Christian traditions, and we give thanks for all the faiths and religions and philosophies and perspectives of the world. We are called in our tradition to love our neighbor. And that does not mean our Unitarian neighbor exclusively, does not mean our liberal neighbor exclusively, does not mean our human neighbor exclusively. It means loving our neighbors who are very different from us. We are one body and one spirit and one hope. Let us be united in love. Let us humble ourselves enough to believe in a better world and to know that we can play a part in creating it with humility, partnering with others, being there for others, listening to one another, and listening also to that great mystery that surrounds us. Say the prayer that Jesus taught, and then we'll have about a minute of silence to surround ourselves with that mystery. I invite you to join, if you wish, in the prayer Jesus taught, the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, and Mother, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. May peace be with you, and may love bring you home wherever you are. So, friends, we'll see if my technological luck holds out. We'll have a closing song. It may take me a minute. Okay. So, ah, close with 146. Tis a gift to be simple. You may know this one. It's funny that we're doing this through two computers and online. But even so, the Quaker hymn remains very true. Traditional hymn, arranged by David Dawson. Tis a gift to be simple. It's okay to come down where we want to be. And when we find ourselves in a place just right, we'll be in the valley of delight. Where true simplicity is there, to raise up the spirit, be sharp, be ashamed. Time will be our delight, by turning with our light. Tis a gift to be simple, tis a gift to be free, tis a gift to share ourselves in the place be in the valley of love, ignite. True simplicity is gain. Be sharp, be ashamed. Time to be our delight. So my time, with God. To greet all his friends, we shan't be ashamed. To turn will be our delight till we come to the valley, to the land of love and delight. Can't quite remember the words, but can remember that simply turning towards love, turning towards the acts of justice, turning towards doing some small work of good in the world, even if our world is very confined at the moment, will bring us to the place where we need to be. So let's turn again. Turn our hearts towards love. Turn our reason and our mind and our imagination towards love. Turn all that we are towards the hope of a better world and the knowledge that we are all in this together. Let us activate that great moral imagination that is latent in us, that is always there, that awareness of unity, that awareness of the love we have for our neighbor, the love we have for this world. Let us turn again, and 'twill be a delight. Blessed be, friends. Thankful for you. God bless you. Have a great week. Amen.